Welcome back, guys. We got the HMS Victory Total Guide Part 2. This is important to kind of get that connective tissue between the Napoleonic Wars and then, of course, the Royal Navy of Great Britain. I got me some tea just for the occasion. You know, we're talking about Great Britain here. We got to have some tea, especially as we go out to sea. I'm not trying to rhyme, but thank you guys for joining me. By the way, another quick announcement. We got a Discord server. It's going to be in the description. Check it out. But let's just jump into it, shall we? We got the HMS Victory Part 2.
HMS Victory, one of Britain's most powerful warships in an age when Britain dominated the seas. During the Napoleonic Wars, such ships were Britain's wooden walls, protecting the homeland from invasion while devastating enemy commerce and protecting Allied shipping. Ships of the line were the largest and most sophisticated war machines of the conflict. Britain had around 140 in total, more than any other nation. But her advantage came less from numbers or better ship design than the qualities of the men who sailed them. Bold and experienced commanders, disciplined and eager crews, all full of confidence.
That's an amazing painting right there.
And accustomed to victory.
I wonder what they're going to talk about this video. True. And by the way, if you haven't seen part 1, go see part 1. We talked about the archetype of the ship and like the actual, the whole design and everything there. The crew.
At the height of the Napoleonic Wars, around 145,000 men served in Britain's Royal Navy, a number comparable to European field armies of the period.
That's insane.
Ships of...
But you gotta remember, the Royal Navy, and this is in the pre-Victorian age, and right after the age of exploration, there is... Like the context of the Royal Navy with 145,000, I wonder how much of that is surrounded Europe and the Isles versus also in the new lands in Americas and the South Asiatic Sea with trade. Does that also accomplish like mercantile ships through the region, as well as like the canals and different areas that are within the world? So like I'm wondering there.
The line, like HMS Victory, required huge crews, not so much to sail her, as to man her heavy guns.
A lot of guns. Over 100.
At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, she had 820 men aboard, a little short of her full complement of 850. Just 15 of these men were commissioned officers. 1 admiral commanding the fleet, 1 captain in command of the ship, 9 naval lieutenants, and 4 Royal Marine officers.
So just so I understand hierarchical naval stuff, captain controls the ship, admiral controls the fleet. And officers I'm guessing officers like manage parts of the ship. Like they're the managers. That makes sense.
Then the senior warrant officers, including the ship's master in charge of navigation, the gunner, responsible for the ship's guns, small arms, powder, and shot, the bosun, responsible for sails and rigging, and who with his mates oversaw all work on deck. 2 ship's carpenters, responsible for keeping the ship afloat and making repairs. The purser, in charge of ship's provisions, a surgeon for the crew's physical welfare, and a chaplain for their spiritual. Victory also had 21 midshipmen. These were young cadet officers, some of whom began their naval careers at just 13.
Wow.
They served a 6-year apprenticeship at sea, learning seamanship, sail handling, navigation, mathematics, and trigonometry.
So they're experienced. This is called specializing.
They'd then be qualified to sit the lieutenant's exam, a rigorous assessment by a board of naval captains. Further promotion to commander, then captain, would depend on merit and, crucially, social and political connections.
Yeah.
The process could be hugely frustrating for those without influential friends, as satirized in this cartoon by the famous illustrator George Cruikshank.
I'm trying to see if I can read that. In sore affiliation, tried by God's command of patience, Job, the great example, stands. But in these days, a trial more severe had been Job's lot, of God had sent him home. Interesting. Okay.
Some naval officers came from aristocratic families, but most were from what today we'd call the middle classes. HMS Victory carried 43 clerks, orderlies, stewards and servants to assist the officers. 69 junior warrant officers, petty officers and their mates held various specialist roles, such as coxswain, armourer and sailmaker.
Wow.
There were 212 able seamen, the veteran sailors. 193 ordinary seamen, with at least a year's service. 87 landsmen, mostly new recruits, only good.
Okay, so landsman is just like, I was thinking when I heard landsman, I'm like, these are the people that are going to go to the land when they go to land. The landsman is just like the most novice you can be, right, before sea boy.
Good for hauling on ropes. 142 Royal Marine non-commissioned officers and privates, soldiers who fought at sea, led amphibious landings and enforced discipline. And 31 ship's boys, many of them orphans plucked from destitution, now destined for a life at sea.
Interns, basically.
Each man was assigned a station for every maneuver. Top men were the fittest, bravest sailors who handled the sails high above deck. Forecastle men were knowledgeable veterans who handled anchors and bowsprit sails. The wasters in the ship's waist and afterguard on the quarterdeck and poop were for hauling on ropes. The crew was organized into two halves, the larboard watch and starboard watch.
Left and right, we knew that.
They took turns on and off duty, except for emergencies when all hands were called on deck. They were further organized into divisions, each commanded by a lieutenant responsible for his men's welfare and conduct.
So how many people is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 20, 40. Okay.
HMS Victory's crew, like that of most British warships, was surprisingly cosmopolitan. Most were from Britain and Ireland, but about 10% were foreigners, including Americans, Italians, Dutch, Maltese and West Indians.
Interesting.
About half were volunteers. The rest had been impressed, meaning they'd been forced into military service by the Navy's notorious press gangs.
Well, that's one way to recruit.
These naval recruitment parties scoured ports and passing ships for British sailors, all of whom were considered fair game for compulsory enlistment.
Wow.
The process was not always entirely peaceful. Navy press gangs were feared and despised by civilians. They were known to seize men who were not sailors or even British, though most were later released if they could prove their identity. And there were limits. Contrary to popular myth, the Navy did not press vagrants, nor did it accept criminals convicted of serious crimes.
Well, yeah, that's a risk factor. Like, so that makes sense. Like, it's a risk factor to have a criminal on. We already know the wheel and the wheel connects to the board, which I forgot what it's called, next to the rudder.
To get the best out of a ship like Victory, the captain had to know his crew and his ship. Every vessel has its own best point of sailing relative to the wind. HMS Victory's was 1 or 2 points off her stern. This means she made her best speed, around 10 knots, sailing in these directions. But large ships do not sail in a straight line, due to leeway, the effect of the wind pushing the ship's hull sideways. This was something the helmsman steering the ship at the ship's wheel had to correct for.
I didn't really think about that. That's interesting. Okay. Okay.
The officer of the watch, usually a lieutenant, was responsible for the ship when on duty, and ordered which sails to set and take in. He would summon the captain if the situation required it. In strong winds, Victory might sail under topsails alone, perhaps with a jib and flying jib. In lighter winds, she would crowd on sail, adding courses, topgansels, and royals. She might even run out the stunsail booms to set studding sails, pronounced stunsails.
And that just looks formidable. Like if there's not a heavy wind, it's gonna look formidable.
This was known as sailing large. But if the wind picked up, stunsails and royals had to be brought in quickly, as spars and sails could be damaged or torn away by a sudden strong gust.
And I know you don't want to be responsible. You do not want to be responsible for some sort of accidental like mishap like that, because then you're just shamed. You might be demoted. Who knows what?
Sailing ship can sail directly into the wind. Victory's closest point of sail was 6 points off the wind. This was known as sailing close hauled or on a bowline. There were two methods of sailing against the wind. The first was tacking. This zigzag approach required precise sail handling and could strain spars and rigging.
Interesting.
The alternative was wearing ship, an easier maneuver to perform, but slower, as it meant going the long way around.
What? So insane. Like the zigzag makes more sense.
Anchoring a large warship like Victory was also a complex operation.
2,000 pounds.
The sea's depth was discovered by casting the lead, literally throwing a lead weight tied to a rope into the sea. The rope clearly marked every fathom, or 6 feet. The preferred depth for anchoring was 40 fathoms or less, though it was possible in deeper water. First, the ship reduced speed by taking in sail. When the ship came to a halt, the anchor was let go, with a marker buoy attached. As current and backed sails began to drive the ship sternwards, the anchor cable was run out, using 3 times the length needed to reach the sea bottom. It was the weight of this giant cable, as much as the anchor, that kept the ship in position.
I mean, that's got to be some heavy rope right there. And that's a dangerous business. And you guys have probably seen that with like ships at sea with anchors and how fast it goes down and the pulleys and all that. This is a little bit more manual process here. But what, like the anchor, it also could be like a burden, you know, if you need to get out of Dodge. And wonder what they did, like if they had to go fast, but the anchor was 240 feet down. Like, what do you do? Like, how fast does that come up?
Depending on weather, tide, and sea bottom, it might be necessary to set several of Victory's anchors to keep the ship safely moored. A less well-known inshore maneuver was kedging. This was a way to drag the ship against wind or tide using manpower alone. The lighter kedge anchor was carried in a ship's boat, rowed out ahead of the ship, and let go. The crew then turned the capstan to haul the ship towards the anchor. This exhausting process was repeated as many times as necessary to move the ship into position.
I bet you were tired after using that.
Another version of this.
Okay, this is probably the worst version I've seen. That tree is gonna snap. I've seen this done. I've done this before with like a little small boat of my own. Like, not that I own a boat, but I've been in lakes and rivers. So like This is an easy, like tying off to a tree. That tree, now, given they probably used a bigger tree than what's shown here, but that tree just looks like it's about to snap.
This was warping, in which ropes were attached to a fixed object, like a strong tree on shore, and the ship hauled towards it.
Maybe a stronger tree than that one. The hotter the war, the sooner the peace. Okay.
In naval combat, the first consideration was always the direction and strength of the wind.
Yeah.
A ship upwind or to windward had the advantage and was said to have the weather gauge. She could choose if and when to initiate battle, while the ship to leeward had to struggle into the wind to reach her adversary. Ships of all nations sometimes flew a false flag, that of another nation, to hide their identity. This was considered fair practice, but to fire on an enemy without first hoisting your true colors was an unpardonable crime.
Yeah. Yeah, unless you're the Black Pearl, I guess.
When about to engage the enemy, the captain would order, "Beat to quarters." To the rattle of the Marines' drums, the ship was cleared for action. All temporary cabins on gun decks were dismantled and taken to the hold, so gun crews could work without obstruction. The sick bay was cleared away and all its patients carried down to the orlop deck. The galley stove was put out to reduce the risk of fire, and ammunition was moved up from the magazines to the gun decks.
Okay. How long would that take? I know you got hundreds of men doing this, but it'd take an hour or so, right? At least a couple hours.
The ship's
Maybe.
boats were launched and towed behind the ship. Here they were less likely to be smashed to splinters by enemy fire, and were immediately ready for any emergency.
Okay.
Sand was poured on the deck for traction, while splinter netting was put up above the decks to protect men from any falling spars or pulleys shot down by enemy fire.
This is so well engineered here. The sand, I mean, by the way, everything that's been engineered probably didn't happen for foresight. It happened from hindsight. So what I mean, obviously, is the sand, people slipped before. The things that have fell, things probably have fell and killed people. So these are we learned from that scenarios.
Every man then took up his station for battle. Captain and officers in full uniform on the quarterdeck. Topmen aloft, ready to trim sail. Sharpshooters on the fighting tops. Carpenter's crew on the orlop deck, ready to plug holes below the waterline. Gunners' mates in the magazine, filling extra cartridges. The surgeon in the cockpit, ready to receive casualties.
Yep. How many people were accompanying the surgeon? It's got to be at least 10 to 20 people, right?
For 3/4 of the crew, battle stations meant the gun decks, manning one of the ship's 104 guns. It was a huge amount of firepower for the age, and made her one of the most heavily armed warships in the world.
One of? What's one of? What do you mean one of? Is there a bigger ship than this one? I'm missing something here?
Her heaviest cannon were the 32-pounders of the lower gun deck. At point-blank range, these guns could punch through 2 feet of solid oak. Heavy breaching ropes held each gun in place. Otherwise, recoil would have sent 4 tons of gun and carriage flying across the deck after every shot.
Smart.
Each gun had a crew of between 10 and 14, which was divided in half if the ship needed to fire on both sides. Each crew was led by a gun captain. He was responsible for aiming the gun, his crew shifting its massive weight with handspikes, crowbars, and wedges. When he was on target, the gun captain either applied a slow match to the touch hole, or as seen here, pulled a lanyard attached to a gun lock to fire the gun. To reload, One man first blocked the vent with his thumb or a stopper to prevent sparks getting into the barrel during loading. The barrel was then sponged to extinguish embers and wormed to remove debris. A gunpowder cartridge was inserted at the muzzle and rammed home with a ramrod, followed by the shot, and then a wad to keep everything in place. The gun was run out into firing position and a pricker inserted into the vent to prick the cartridge and spill the gunpowder. The gun captain then added powder from his powder horn to the vent and priming pan. The gun was now primed, ready to fire again.
Easy enough.
This process took an experienced British gun crew around 90 seconds.
Do you think you guys could do it?
And they were generally faster and more accurate than their adversaries. As a battle wore on, the firing rate would fall dramatically due to exhaustion and casualties. Conditions on a gun deck during battle must have been horrendous. Noise, smoke, sweat, and gruesome wounds caused by shot, flying wooden splinters, and accidents. Battles usually began with a broadside, a ship firing all guns on one side in quick succession. For greater impact, the first broadside could be double-shotted, every gun loaded with 2 rounds.
Oh.
To guarantee penetration of an enemy ship's hull, the range should be less than 500 yards. Many captains preferred extreme close range to fight yardarm to yardarm. The deadliest maneuver was to rake the enemy, to fire a broadside into their stem or stern.
Why is that deadliest?
Round shot would smash its way the length of the ship,
That's why.
dealing death and mayhem as it went.
That's why.
French ships tended to fire high, on the uproll, aiming for masts and rigging to immobilize the enemy. British ships aimed low, for the hull, trying to knock out guns and crew. At long range, a mile or more, round shot could be skipped across the sea, like skimming pebbles across a pond.
That's another way to do it. That's pretty interesting and cool even.
Round shot, a solid iron ball, was the most commonly used type of ammunition.
Pounders right there.
Specialist ammunition, such as bar shot, also known as double-headed shot,
That's just dumbbells, you know? What?
or chain shot, was used to target masts and rigging.
Interesting. Okay.
At close range, grape shot and canister, both packed with multiple smaller projectiles, turned a gun or carronade into a giant shotgun and were used to wreak havoc on an enemy deck.
Wow.
A captain might decide to finish the fight by boarding an enemy warship. Designated boarders armed themselves with muskets, pistols, cutlasses, and half-pikes. The enemy ship was bound tight by grappling hooks, and after a shower of grenados and stink pots, an early form of tear gas, the boarders would swarm across to the enemy deck. In such actions, morale, aggression, and momentum counted more than tactics. Though brutal, such battles were usually over quickly.
I'm sure. My goodness. All hands ahoy! Life at sea.
Combat at sea was relatively rare.
Yeah.
Great fleet actions, such as Trafalgar and the Nile, were rarer still. Just a handful of days spread across 20 years of war. Weeks and months often lay between any encounter with the enemy. Then life at sea was dominated by naval routine, and the passage of time marked by the ship's bell. The naval day began at noon, determined by the officers' observation of the sun with their sextants. The moment the sun reached its highest point was noon. The ship's hourglass was turned, and the bell rung 8 times to mark the beginning of the afternoon watch. Half an hour later, as determined by a half-hour sandglass, the bell was rung once. A half hour later, it was rung twice, and so on. So 5 bells in the afternoon watch was 2:30 p.m. 8 bells meant the start of a new watch, sending half the crew below deck to rest or do other tasks, and bringing the other half on duty.
A 4-hour workday? Like that.
There were 7 watches in all, though the first and second dog watches were only 2 hours long.
My goodness, yeah, dang.
This meant the 2 halves of the crew switched their routine each day, and one half wasn't always stuck with the same night watches.
Interesting.
Senior officers slept in a hanging cot. For everyone else, bed was a hammock strung up from the ship's beams. Most of the men slept on the middle or lower gun decks, their hammocks suspended between the guns, just 16 inches apart. But as most ships operated a 2-watch system, half the crew on duty while the other half slept, about half the hammocks were empty at any given time.
Makes sense.
In normal
I wondered, did you have like your own hammock, or was it like first come, first served?
conditions, only part of the watch was required to sail the ship. The rest carried out various tasks, not least cleaning the ship, scrubbing decks, polishing brass, and painting woodwork. This was a matter of maintenance and hygiene, as well as collective pride in their ship's appearance. The crew were fed 3 times daily, though only dinner at noon was a hot meal.
Wait, what? Supper wasn't a hot meal?
They organized themselves into messes of about 8 men, each taking his turn to fetch cooked food from the galley, which was eaten at a table suspended between the guns. Naval food wasn't fancy, but it was sufficient, even for men engaged in long hours of hard labor.
Weekly allowance per man. So biscuit, beef, pork, peas, oatmeal, butter.
Apart from the ship's substantial stores of salted beef, pork, and ship's biscuit, the ship took on fresh meat, including livestock, fresh vegetables, and water, at every possible opportunity. Most of the crew probably ate better at sea than they would have in civilian life.
Really? Because there wasn't that. That's interesting. Was it really that bad? Hands on like quality meat?
As well as the daily routine dictated by the ship's bell, there were weekly rituals. Clothes and hammocks washed and hung out to dry once a week, weather permitting. Gunnery practice by divisions. And on Sundays, a church service led by the ship's chaplain, if there was one, or the captain. This was followed, at least once a month, by a public reading of the Articles of War, the regulations that governed conduct and discipline at sea.
Swearing, drunkenness, and scandalous actions. All flag officers, all persons in belonging to His Majesty's ships or vessels of war, being guilty of profane oaths, cursings, execrations, drunkenness, uncleanness, other scandalous actions, and derogation of God's honor, corruption of good manners, shall incur such punishment as a court-martial thou think fit to impose, and as the nature and degree of their offense shall deserve. Interesting. Very
The articles listed 36 offences, from drunkenness to theft, mutiny, cowardice, and striking an officer. Half of these were punishable by death. In several cases, it was the only sentence
holding intelligence. That's treason.
allowed. British discipline at sea was notoriously severe. Crimes for which a sailor was not hanged would usually lead to a flogging with the cat o' nine tails. Drunkenness was the most common offence, not unconnected to the Navy's daily allowance of a gallon of beer per man in home waters, or half a pint of rum or other spirits overseas. This, mixed 4 parts water to 1 part spirits, with lemon or lime juice added to prevent scurvy, was the famous Navy grog. Any man caught drunk or asleep on duty might get 12 lashes, delivered by a boatswain's mate in front of the assembled crew. Serious crimes, such as desertion, might result in 200 lashes or more, a punishment so severe it sometimes killed the prisoner.
Oh yeah, I bet.
Some naval captains were ferocious tyrants, but most knew that harsh punishment was best used sparingly.
Yeah, you don't want your whole crew looking
British
like that.
sailors did not expect an easy life, but did expect to be treated fairly and with dignity. If not, there could be trouble.
Mutiny.
In 1797, the Royal Navy experienced a large-scale mutiny at Spithead, affecting 16 ships of the line.
Wow.
It was effectively a strike for better pay, as sailors hadn't had a pay rise in more than a century. The mutiny was settled without violence, and the sailors largely got what they wanted. A second mutiny at the Nore made more radical demands, with some crews threatening to defect to France. This time, the authorities were determined to set an example, and hanged 29 ringleaders. Despite hard discipline and service, the British Navy produced crews that were experienced and able, bound together by long service at sea. Men that bold commanders knew they could rely on. The British Navy, well-manned, well-resourced, and backed by a powerful economy, was able to secure complete naval dominance during the Napoleonic Wars. It would prove a crucial factor in Napoleon's defeat. HMS Victory, having played her part, was placed in the Naval Reserve at the end of the war. Narrowly escaping the Breakers' Yard, she became the flagship of the Port Admiral of Portsmouth on England's south coast, and later flagship of the Royal Navy's Commander-in-Chief. After a major refit, Victory began a new life as a museum ship, opening to the public in 1928.
Cool stuff.
Today, she is undergoing another major conservation project to deal with the many challenges faced by a 250-year-old wooden sailing ship.
Wow.
It will ensure her survival far into the future, as a unique memorial to this dramatic age of naval warfare.
Gotta go see it. Gotta go see it. I wonder how this compares to, is it the USS Independence? Is that it? I wonder how it compares to. I think it's definitely older, but in terms of like the similarities and whatnot. Wow. Is this the greatest ship of all time? Um in in this time period? Seems like it. Now there's a lot of people that have their own thoughts about what is the greatest ship of all time, and I'd love for you to tell me what is the greatest ship of all time. Is this it? Is there another one? Is there one that uh might have belonged to another nation? Uh, I'd love to hear that out. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this. We're gonna jump into the Napoleon series next. Back at it. Believe Cape St. Vincent might be our next video. So be sure to hit the bell and for the notifications to subscribe if you haven't already. Um, Join our Discord, conversate, and send us recommendations. And until next time, peace out, guys.